Colonel Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the military airfield, watching the early morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. At 38, she had earned every stripe on her uniform through years of dedication, sacrifice, and proving herself in a world that often questioned whether a woman belonged in positions of military leadership. Today would be different from any other day in her 20-year career. Today, she would take command of Joint Task Force Alpha, a multi-branch operation that had been struggling under ineffective leadership for months. The helicopter blades whirred overhead as Sarah adjusted her cap and checked her watch. She had arrived early, as was her habit, wanting to observe the base operations before officially announcing her presence. What she saw troubled her deeply. Personnel moved with little sense of urgency, equipment sat improperly maintained, and the general atmosphere seemed to lack the discipline and focus essential for military effectiveness. Sarah had read the reports during her flight from Washington. Joint Task Force Alpha was responsible for coordinating intelligence operations across 3 different military branches in a region critical to national security. The previous commander, Colonel James Richardson, had been relieved of duty after a series of operational failures that had embarrassed the Pentagon and potentially compromised ongoing missions. Now, Sarah was tasked with rebuilding morale, restoring operational effectiveness, and proving that the task force could fulfill its crucial mission. As she walked across the tarmac toward the main headquarters building, Sarah noticed several junior officers gathered near a maintenance hangar. Their conversation carried across the morning air, and she caught fragments that made her pause. They were discussing the incoming commander, speculating about who would be taking over the troubled unit. What she heard next stopped her in her tracks. "I heard they're sending some desk jockey from the Pentagon," one voice said dismissively. "Probably another political appointment who's never seen real action. As long as it's not another micromanager," another responded. "We need someone who understands how things work in the field." Sarah continued walking, making mental notes about the attitudes she was encountering. It was clear that morale was even lower than the reports had indicated, and that the personnel had little faith in leadership from higher command. This would make her job significantly more challenging, but also more important. The headquarters building was a sprawling concrete structure that had been hastily constructed during the early phases of the operation. Inside, Sarah found a maze of temporary offices, briefing rooms, and communication centers. The building buzzed with activity, but it was the kind of unfocused energy that suggested busy work rather than purposeful action. Her first stop was the administrative office, where she needed to formally check in and receive her briefings. The sergeant at the front desk, a weathered man in his 40s named Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, looked up as she approached. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone professional but lacking enthusiasm. "I'm Colonel Martinez, reporting for duty as the new commander of Joint Task Force Alpha," Sarah replied, presenting her orders. Rodriguez's eyebrows raised slightly as he examined the paperwork. "Ma'am, I wasn't expecting— we weren't told when the new commander would arrive. I prefer to observe operations before announcing my presence," Sarah explained. "It gives me a better sense of the unit's actual condition rather than what people want me to see." As Rodriguez processed her arrival paperwork, Sarah used the opportunity to study the administrative area. Files were stacked haphazardly, communication boards were outdated, and the general organization left much to be desired. She made mental notes about the immediate changes that would need to be implemented. "Ma'am, I'll need to notify the senior staff of your arrival," Rodriguez said. "Major Thompson is currently serving as acting commander until you officially take over." "Major Thompson?" Sarah inquired, noting that this name hadn't appeared in her briefing materials. "Yes, ma'am. He's been coordinating operations since Colonel Richardson's departure. He's been doing his best under difficult circumstances." The diplomatic way Rodriguez phrased his response told Sarah everything she needed to know about Major Thompson's effectiveness. She decided to observe him in action before introducing herself formally. "Sergeant, I'd like to review the current operational status before meeting with the senior staff. Can you direct me to the main briefing room?" "Of course, ma'am. Down this corridor, 3rd door on the right. They're conducting the morning briefing right now." Sarah made her way to the briefing room, where she could hear voices discussing the day's activities. She positioned herself outside the partially open door, where she could observe without being noticed. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the unit's condition. Major Thompson, a man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair, stood at the front of the room addressing a mixed group of officers from different branches. His presentation was disorganized, his demeanor uncertain, and his grasp of the strategic situation appeared superficial. More troubling was the obvious lack of respect from his audience. Officers checked their phones, whispered among themselves, and generally displayed the kind of inattention that would have been unthinkable in a properly functioning unit. Intelligence reports indicate increased activity in Sector 7, Thompson was saying, pointing vaguely at a map that appeared to be several days out of date. We need to consider our response options. A Navy lieutenant commander near the back of the room raised his hand. Sir, what about the coordination with the local forces we discussed yesterday? Have we received any updates on their readiness status? Thompson shuffled through his papers, clearly unprepared for the question. I'll have to get back to you on that, Commander Peterson. There are still some details being worked out. Sarah watched as several officers exchanged knowing glances. It was obvious that details being worked out was Thompson's standard response when he didn't have answers. This kind of leadership vacuum was exactly what had led to the operational failures that had plagued the task force. As the briefing continued, Sarah began to form a clear picture of the challenges she would face. The unit wasn't just struggling with low morale, it was suffering from a complete breakdown in effective command structure. Different branches were operating independently, communication was poor, and there was no coherent strategic vision guiding their activities. The briefing ended with Thompson giving vague instructions about maintaining current operations and staying alert for new developments. As the officers filed out, Sarah heard several conversations that confirmed her assessment. Same old Thompson, one officer muttered to another. All questions, no answers. I heard the Pentagon is finally sending someone to replace him, his companion replied. Can't happen soon enough. Sarah decided it was time to introduce herself. She waited until Thompson was alone in the briefing room, then knocked on the doorframe. Major Thompson? I'm Colonel Martinez. I'm here to assume command of Joint Task Force Alpha. Thompson looked up from his papers, surprise evident on his face. Ma'am, I wasn't expecting, welcome to the task force. I've been serving as acting commander since Colonel Richardson's departure. So, I understand. I'd like to schedule a comprehensive briefing with all senior staff for this afternoon. Can you arrange that? Of course, ma'am. Might I ask? Well, your background is quite impressive, according to the notification we received. Intelligence operations, strategic planning, several combat deployments. The unit could certainly benefit from that kind of experience. Sarah studied Thompson carefully. He seemed genuinely relieved to be handing over responsibility, which suggested he understood his own limitations. This would make the transition easier, but it also indicated how desperate the situation had become. Major, I've observed this morning's briefing and reviewed the operational reports. I need you to be completely honest with me about the unit's current capabilities and challenges. Thompson's shoulders sagged slightly. Ma'am, I'll be frank. Morale is at an all-time low. The different branches aren't communicating effectively. Our intelligence gathering has been spotty, and we've had several minor operational failures that have damaged confidence in our abilities. The personnel are capable, but they need leadership they can trust. And Captain Morrison? Sarah asked, referring to a name that had appeared frequently in the problematic incident reports. Captain Morrison is challenging, ma'am. He's technically competent, but he has strong opinions about chain of command and hasn't been particularly cooperative with the temporary leadership structure. Sarah made a mental note that Captain Morrison would likely be her first significant leadership challenge. Officers who questioned authority during transitions often set the tone for how the entire unit would respond to new leadership. The rest of the morning was spent in meetings with department heads, reviewing operational files, and getting a sense of the base's physical condition. Each conversation reinforced Sarah's initial assessment. Joint Task Force Alpha was a unit with good people who had lost confidence in their leadership and their mission. The turning point she anticipated came during lunch in the officers' mess. Sarah had chosen to eat with the general population rather than in the senior officers' dining area, wanting to hear unfiltered conversations about the unit's condition. She found a table near several junior officers and listened as they discussed their frustrations. I heard the new commander is supposed to arrive this week, one lieutenant was saying. Think it'll make any difference? Probably just another careerist looking to punch their ticket, responded a captain whom Sarah recognized from the morning briefing. These Pentagon types never understand field operations. At least it can't get worse, the lieutenant replied. Thompson means well, but he's in over his head. Sarah was about to introduce herself when she noticed Captain Morrison entering the mess hall. She had studied his file during the morning review, and his record was a study in contradictions. Excellent technical skills, strong performance in individual assignments, but a pattern of conflicts with superior officers and resistance to new policies. Morrison was a tall man in his mid-30s, with an athletic build and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. He collected his lunch and scanned the room before choosing a table with several other officers. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the interaction. "Any word on when we'll meet our new commanding officer?" one of the officers at Morrison's table asked. "Does it matter?" Morrison replied dismissively. "Whoever they send will be another political appointment who will spend 6 months learning what we already know, implement some changes to justify their presence, then move on to their next promotion." "Come on, John," another officer interjected. "Maybe we'll get lucky this time." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Lucky. The Pentagon doesn't send their best people to clean up messes. They send people who need something to put on their resume. Mark my words, we'll be dealing with another inexperienced officer who thinks they can fix everything with new procedures and motivational speeches. Sarah had heard enough. She stood up and walked directly to Morrison's table, her decision made to address the situation immediately rather than let negative attitudes continue to fester. "Captain Morrison?" she said, stopping beside his chair. Morrison looked up, taking in her colonel's insignia with obvious surprise. "Yes, ma'am?" "I'm Colonel Martinez, and I'll be assuming command of Joint Task Force Alpha effective immediately. I couldn't help but overhear your assessment of Pentagon leadership. I'm curious about your thoughts on what kind of commander this unit needs." The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter as nearby conversations stopped. Morrison's face flushed slightly, but to his credit, he stood up and faced Sarah directly. "Ma'am, I apologize if my comments were inappropriate. I didn't realize. No need to apologize for honest opinions, Captain. In fact, I value straight talk from my officers. What I'm interested in is whether you believe effective leadership is possible for this unit, regardless of where that leadership comes from." Morrison glanced around the table at his colleagues, then met Sarah's gaze directly. "Ma'am, this unit has enormous potential. We have skilled personnel, important missions, and the resources to succeed. What we've lacked is consistent leadership that understands both the strategic importance of our work and the practical challenges of coordinating multi-branch operations. And you believe that kind of leadership must come from field experience rather than strategic planning backgrounds? I believe it must come from leaders who listen to their people, understand the operational environment, and make decisions based on mission requirements rather than political considerations." Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing that Morrison was testing her as much as she was evaluating him. This was exactly the kind of moment that would determine whether she could establish credibility with the unit's informal leaders. "Captain, I appreciate your candor. You're absolutely right that this unit has enormous potential, and you're also right that it needs leadership focused on mission success rather than career advancement. I look forward to working with officers who share that commitment." She turned to address the broader group of officers within hearing range. "I'm Colonel Martinez, and I'm here to restore this task force to full operational effectiveness. I'll be meeting with all department heads this afternoon, but I want everyone to know that my door is always open for honest feedback about how we can improve our operations." As Sarah walked away, she could feel the weight of multiple conversations resuming behind her. She had made her first impression, but she knew that the real test would come in the days ahead as she began implementing the changes necessary to transform Joint Task Force Alpha into the effective unit it needed to become. The afternoon briefings confirmed what Sarah had suspected about the depth of the problems facing the task force. Each department head presented a litany of challenges: outdated equipment, unclear mission parameters, poor interbranch communication, and low personnel confidence in leadership decisions. However, Sarah also detected an undercurrent of hope in these conversations. These were professional military officers who wanted to succeed. They just needed leadership they could trust and follow. Her final meeting of the day was with Major Thompson, who would be transitioning to a new assignment within the week. As they reviewed the handover procedures, Thompson shared insights that didn't appear in any official reports. "Ma'am, if I may speak freely, the biggest challenge you'll face isn't operational or logistical, it's cultural. This task force was thrown together quickly with personnel from different branches who had different training, different procedures, and different ways of thinking about problems. Colonel Richardson tried to impose uniformity through regulations and procedures, but that just created resentment." "What would you recommend?" Sarah asked. "Find ways to leverage the diversity instead of fighting it. The Navy personnel think differently about logistics than Army personnel do, and the Air Force approaches intelligence differently than either of them. If you can harness those different perspectives instead of trying to standardize them, the task force could be incredibly effective." Sarah appreciated Thompson's insight and made note of his recommendation. As the day ended, she felt confident that she understood the scope of the challenge ahead of her, but also optimistic about the potential for success. That evening, as she settled into her new quarters, Sarah reflected on the conversations and observations of her first day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new opportunities to begin building the kind of unit that Joint Task Force Alpha was meant to be. The question was whether she could establish the credibility and trust necessary to lead effectively, especially with skeptics like Captain Morrison who would be watching every decision she made. Little did she know that her biggest test would come sooner than expected, and that it would require her to demonstrate not just her authority, but her ability to lead under pressure when the stakes were higher than anyone imagined. The alarm pierced through the quiet morning air at 0347 hours, jolting Sarah from the light sleep that had become her norm since taking command. Emergency alerts at Joint Task Force Alpha were not uncommon, but something about the persistent, urgent tone of this one made her blood run cold. She was dressed and out of her quarters within 3 minutes, her military training taking over as she ran toward the command center. The hallways buzzed with activity as personnel rushed to their stations. Sarah noticed immediately that the response seemed more coordinated than what she had observed during her first week at the base. The daily drills and protocol reviews she had implemented were already showing results, though she hadn't expected to test them under actual emergency conditions so soon. Lieutenant Colonel James Park, her deputy commander and one of the few officers who had immediately embraced her leadership style, met her at the entrance to the command center. His face was grim, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Ma'am, we have a situation developing rapidly in Sector 9, Park reported as they walked briskly toward the main operations board. "Initial intelligence suggests coordinated hostile activity across multiple points of interest." Sarah's mind immediately shifted into tactical mode. Sector 9 contained several critical infrastructure elements that were vital to regional stability. Any coordinated attack there would have implications far beyond the immediate area of operations. "What's our current intelligence picture?" she asked, scanning the large digital displays that showed real-time data from various sources. "Fragmentary, ma'am. We started receiving unusual communication intercepts approximately 2 hours ago, but the pattern didn't become clear until 30 minutes ago. Multiple cell phone towers went dark simultaneously, and satellite imagery shows unusual vehicle movement near 3 separate facilities." Sarah studied the information being displayed on the screens around the command center. The pattern was indeed troubling. Whoever was behind this activity had clearly planned their operations carefully and had significant resources at their disposal. This was not the work of a small, disorganized group. "Where's Captain Morrison?" she asked, knowing that his technical expertise would be crucial in analyzing the developing situation. "He's in the communications center, ma'am, trying to establish contact with our assets in the field. We've lost contact with 2 reconnaissance teams that were conducting routine patrols in the area." The mention of missing reconnaissance teams sent a chill through Sarah. Losing contact with field teams was every commander's nightmare, especially when hostile activity was confirmed in their area of operations. She needed to make critical decisions quickly, but she also needed accurate information to base those decisions on. As they entered the main command center, Sarah was pleased to see that the protocols she had established were being followed. Officers from different branches were coordinating effectively. Information was being shared rapidly across departments, and there was a sense of purposeful urgency rather than panic. Captain Morrison looked up from a bank of communication equipment as she approached. Despite their rocky first encounter, he had proven to be one of her most valuable officers once he understood that she was committed to mission success rather than personal advancement. Ma'am, I've been able to re-establish partial contact with Team Bravo, Morrison reported. They're reporting multiple hostile contacts moving toward the primary power station. Team Alpha remains silent, but their last known position was approximately 15 kilometers northeast of Team Bravo's current location. What about local forces? Are they aware of the situation? We've been trying to coordinate with local military units, but their communication systems appear to be compromised. We're getting intermittent responses, but nothing coherent enough to establish effective coordination. Sarah realized that Joint Task Force Alpha was likely the only organized military presence capable of responding effectively to whatever was developing in Sector 9. This was exactly the kind of situation the task force had been created to handle, but it would also be the ultimate test of whether the changes she had implemented could work under real-world pressure. I need a complete tactical assessment in 15 minutes, she announced to the room. Intelligence analysis, available resources, possible response options, and risk factors. Captain Morrison, I want you to focus on re-establishing communication with our field teams and getting a clearer picture of the hostile activities. As the command center burst into focused activity, Sarah pulled Lieutenant Colonel Park aside for a private conversation. Jim, how confident are you in our personnel's readiness for this kind of operation? Park considered the question carefully. Ma'am, the training and protocol changes you've implemented have definitely improved our coordination. But this will be the first time we've had to execute a complex operation under your command. Some of the officers are still adjusting to your leadership style. And Captain Morrison specifically? Morrison is professional, and he's been supportive of the operational changes you've made. But he's also been vocal about wanting to see how you handle a crisis situation. I think he's still evaluating whether you can lead effectively when lives are on the line. Sarah nodded. She had sensed that Morrison and several other officers were withholding final judgment about her capabilities until they could observe her under pressure. Today would likely determine whether she could earn their complete confidence and loyalty. The tactical assessment briefing 15 minutes later painted a sobering picture. Intelligence analysis suggested that at least 40 hostile operatives were conducting a coordinated operation designed to disrupt critical infrastructure in Sector 9. The power station, water treatment facility, and communication hub were all under threat, and the loss of any of these facilities would have devastating effects on the surrounding population. More troubling was the sophisticated nature of the attack. The hostiles had demonstrated advanced planning, professional execution, and access to equipment that suggested state-level support. This was not a local insurgent operation. It was a strategic assault designed to create maximum disruption and chaos. Recommended response options? Sarah asked the assembled senior staff. Major Rodriguez, the task force's operations officer, presented 3 alternatives. Option 1 was to coordinate with higher headquarters and request additional resources before taking action. Option 2 was to focus on defensive measures and intelligence gathering while avoiding direct engagement. Option 3 was to conduct immediate offensive operations designed to disrupt the hostile activities before they could achieve their objectives. Time factors? Sarah inquired. Ma'am, intelligence suggests that the hostile forces plan to execute their main assault within the next 6 hours, Morrison reported. If we wait for additional resources, we'll likely be responding to a completed attack rather than preventing one. Sarah studied the tactical displays, weighing the risks and opportunities of each option. Option 1 was the safest from a career standpoint, but would likely result in significant civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. Option 2 might limit the damage but would allow the hostiles to maintain initiative. Option 3 offered the best chance of preventing catastrophic damage, but would require her to commit the task force to combat operations without higher authorization. What are our available resources for immediate deployment? She asked. Lieutenant Colonel Park provided a comprehensive overview. The task force had 2 helicopter-borne assault teams, 1 armored reconnaissance unit, 1 intelligence collection team, and sophisticated communication and coordination capabilities. While not large in number, these were highly trained, well-equipped personnel who could potentially achieve tactical surprise against the hostile forces. Ma'am, Captain Morrison interjected, I need to point out that committing to immediate offensive operations means taking full responsibility for the outcome. If something goes wrong, you won't have the cover of higher authorization or additional resources to share the blame. Sarah looked around the command center at the faces of the officers who would execute whatever decision she made. These were professional military personnel who had volunteered for dangerous assignments because they believed in serving their country. They deserved leadership that would make decisions based on mission requirements rather than career considerations. "Captain Morrison, you're absolutely right about the risks," she replied. "But we didn't join the military to avoid responsibility when people's lives are at stake. Our mission is to protect critical infrastructure and civilian populations. That's what we're going to do." She turned to address the entire command center. "We're going to execute Option 3 with immediate effect. I'm authorizing offensive operations designed to neutralize the hostile threat before they can achieve their objectives. All personnel will follow established protocols, maintain constant communication, and prioritize the safety of civilian populations." The response was immediate and professional. Officers began implementing the complex coordination required for multi-branch combat operations, while Sarah worked with the senior staff to refine tactical details. The next 4 hours tested every system and procedure that Sarah had implemented during her brief tenure as commander. Communication protocols that had seemed excessive during training exercises proved essential for coordinating multiple elements across a complex battlefield. Decision-making procedures that had generated initial resistance from experienced officers enabled rapid responses to changing tactical situations. Most importantly, the cultural changes Sarah had worked to foster began to manifest under pressure. Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel worked together seamlessly, leveraging their different capabilities and perspectives to create tactical solutions that none of them could have developed independently. Captain Morrison emerged as a key figure in orchestrating the technical aspects of the operation. His ability to maintain communication with multiple elements while analyzing intelligence data in real time proved invaluable. More significantly, his visible confidence in Sarah's leadership began to influence other officers who had been skeptical about her capabilities. The first major test came when Team Bravo reported that they were outnumbered and under heavy fire while attempting to secure the power station. Standard procedure would have been to request permission from higher headquarters before committing additional resources to what was clearly becoming a significant combat engagement. Sarah made the decision to immediately deploy the helicopter-borne assault team to support Team Bravo without seeking higher authorization. It was exactly the kind of decision that could end her career if the operation failed. But it was also the kind of leadership that combat personnel needed to see from their commander. "That gathering is immediate and constant communication with both teams, and I need real-time intelligence on hostile positions and movements." "Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, if I may say so, this is exactly the kind of leadership this task force needs. Clear decisions, acceptance of responsibility, and commitment to mission success." The comment surprised Sarah, both because of its timing and because it came from Morrison. She realized that he was not just expressing personal support, but was making a statement that other officers in the command center would hear and consider. The helicopter assault team's arrival at the power station marked a turning point in the engagement. The combination of ground forces already in contact and air-delivered reinforcements created tactical advantages that the hostile forces had not anticipated. Within 2 hours, the threat to the power station was neutralized, with minimal damage to the facility and no civilian casualties. However, the success at the power station was overshadowed by the continued silence from Team Alpha. Intelligence indicated that hostile forces were still moving toward the water treatment facility. But without Team Alpha's reconnaissance data, Sarah was operating with incomplete information about the threat. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Colonel Park reported, "we're getting intermittent signals from Team Alpha's area, but nothing coherent enough to establish their status or location." Sarah faced another critical decision. She could commit additional resources to searching for Team Alpha, but that would reduce her capability to respond to the continuing threat against the water treatment facility. Alternatively, she could focus on the known threat while continuing efforts to locate the missing team. It was Captain Morrison who suggested a third option. "Ma'am, what if we use the intelligence collection team to establish overwatch positions that could potentially locate Team Alpha, while also providing intelligence support for operations against the water treatment facility?" The suggestion was tactically sound and demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that Sarah had been trying to encourage. It also represented a level of trust and cooperation from Morrison that had been absent during her first week at the task force. "Approved," Sarah decided. Deploy the intelligence collection team to establish overwatch positions with dual mission requirements. Locate Team Alpha and provide tactical intelligence for operations against the water treatment facility. The decision proved correct. Within an hour, the intelligence team had located Team Alpha, who had been forced to take defensive positions after their vehicle was disabled by hostile fire. More importantly, they had identified the hostile forces approaching the water treatment facility and confirmed that a coordinated assault was planned for the early evening. With complete intelligence on hostile positions and intentions, Sarah was able to coordinate a preemptive strike that neutralized the threat to the water treatment facility before the hostiles could execute their planned assault. The operation was a complete tactical success, with all objectives secured, hostile forces neutralized or dispersed, and no friendly casualties. As the sun set over Sector 9, Sarah stood in the command center, reviewing the after-action reports from the day's operations. Joint Task Force Alpha had demonstrated that it could function as the effective, coordinated unit she had envisioned. More importantly, the officers and personnel had demonstrated confidence in her leadership under the most demanding circumstances. Captain Morrison approached her as she finished reading the final report. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology for my initial assessment of your capabilities. Today's operations demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership this task force needs. Captain, I appreciate that, but today's success belongs to every person who executed their responsibilities. My job is to make good decisions and provide clear direction. Your job is to make those decisions work in practice. Today proved we can do both." Morrison smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived at the task force. "Ma'am, I think this unit is finally ready to achieve its full potential." As Sarah prepared to brief higher headquarters on the day's operations, she reflected on how much had changed since her arrival just 1 week earlier. The transformation hadn't been complete. There were still operational improvements to implement and personnel issues to address. But today had proven that Joint Task Force Alpha could function as an elite unit capable of handling complex, high-stakes operations. More importantly, today had established the foundation of trust and confidence that would enable even greater achievements in the future. The officers and personnel now knew that their commander would make difficult decisions, accept full responsibility for the consequences, and prioritize mission success and personnel safety above personal career considerations. The real test, however, would come in the days ahead as Sarah worked to build on this success and continue transforming Joint Task Force Alpha into the premier multi-branch unit it was designed to become. Today had been about proving capability under pressure. Tomorrow would be about sustained excellence in everything the task force was asked to do. 3 weeks after the successful operations in Sector 9, Colonel Sarah Martinez found herself facing an entirely different kind of challenge. The Pentagon had taken notice of Joint Task Force Alpha's dramatic improvement in performance, and with that attention came both opportunities and complications that would test her leadership in ways she hadn't anticipated. The morning began with an encrypted communication from General Patricia Hayes, the Pentagon official responsible for overseeing joint operations. The message was brief but loaded with implications. Outstanding work on recent operations. Preparing to expand JTF Alpha mission parameters. Expect visit from evaluation team next week. Maintain current operational tempo. Sarah stared at the message, understanding immediately what it meant. Success had brought scrutiny, and scrutiny meant that every aspect of the task force's operations would be examined by people who might not understand the delicate balance she had worked to establish. Worse, an expanded mission would likely mean new personnel, new equipment, and new complications that could disrupt the unit cohesion she had fought so hard to build. She called for an immediate meeting with her senior staff. As the officers assembled in the main briefing room, Sarah could see both pride and concern on their faces. Word about the Pentagon's interest had spread quickly through the base, and everyone understood that change was coming whether they wanted it or not. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, "I've received word that our recent success has attracted attention from the highest levels. Within the next week, we'll be hosting an evaluation team from the Pentagon, and it appears likely that our mission parameters will be expanded significantly." Captain Morrison raised his hand immediately. "Ma'am, what kind of expansion are we talking about? Personnel, geographic area, or mission scope?" "All three, potentially," Sarah replied. The details haven't been finalized, but initial indications suggest we could be looking at doubling our personnel strength, expanding our area of responsibility, and taking on additional mission sets that would require new capabilities. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the implications. Lieutenant Colonel Park was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, that kind of expansion could fundamentally change the character of this unit. We've spent months building trust and establishing effective coordination procedures. Adding that many new people and new missions could set us back to where we were when you first arrived." Sarah had been thinking about exactly that concern since receiving the message from General Hayes. The task force had achieved its current effectiveness through careful attention to personnel dynamics, gradual implementation of new procedures, and the building of trust relationships that couldn't be replicated quickly with new personnel. "You're absolutely right, Jim," she acknowledged. "That's why we need to approach this expansion very carefully. If we're going to maintain our effectiveness while growing, we need to have a clear plan for integration and a strong foundation that can absorb new elements without losing what makes us effective." Major Rodriguez, the operations officer, looked skeptical. "Ma'am, with all due respect, large-scale expansions rarely work smoothly. We've seen other units struggle for years after rapid growth periods. The Pentagon tends to assume that successful units can scale up without losing their effectiveness, but the reality is usually very different." Sarah recognized the validity of Rodriguez's concern, but she also understood that refusing expansion wasn't an option. Units that tried to resist Pentagon initiatives usually found themselves marginalized or disbanded. The challenge was to manage the expansion in a way that preserved the task force's capabilities while meeting the requirements from higher headquarters. "Major, you're right about the challenges, but we also need to consider the opportunities," she replied. "If we can successfully manage this expansion, Joint Task Force Alpha could become the model for joint operations across the military. That would give us resources, influence, and mission opportunities that we could never achieve as a smaller unit." Captain Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "Ma'am, what do you need from us to make this work?" The question surprised Sarah, not because Morrison had asked it, but because of the way he had phrased it. Instead of focusing on the problems or expressing skepticism about the expansion, he was immediately thinking about solutions and how he could contribute. It was exactly the kind of leadership mindset she had been working to cultivate throughout the task force. "I need each of you to identify the key elements that make your departments effective. What are the procedures, relationships, and capabilities that we absolutely must preserve during expansion? Once we understand that, we can develop integration strategies that protect our core strengths while adding new capabilities." The discussion that followed was one of the most productive Sarah had experienced since taking command. Officers from different branches worked together to identify the critical success factors that had enabled the task force's recent achievements. They discussed everything from communication protocols to decision-making procedures to the informal relationships that enabled rapid coordination during crisis situations. What emerged was a comprehensive understanding of the organizational culture they had built, and the specific elements that would need to be protected during any expansion. More importantly, the discussion revealed innovative ideas about how new personnel could be integrated in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the unit's capabilities. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about the expansion challenges ahead. Her staff had demonstrated the kind of mature, solutions-oriented thinking that would be essential for successful growth. However, she also understood that the real test would come when new personnel arrived and existing relationships were disrupted. The evaluation team from the Pentagon arrived exactly 1 week later, led by Brigadier General Robert Chen, a respected officer with extensive experience in joint operations. Sarah had researched Chen's background and knew that he had a reputation for thorough, fair assessments and practical recommendations. However, she also knew that his evaluation would largely determine how the expansion proceeded and what resources would be made available to support it. General Chen's first request was for a comprehensive briefing on the task force's current capabilities and recent operational successes. Sarah had prepared extensively for this presentation, knowing that it would set the tone for the entire evaluation process. "General Chen, members of the evaluation team," Sarah began. "Joint Task Force Alpha has achieved a 300% improvement in operational effectiveness over the past 2 months. This improvement is reflected in mission success rates, personnel satisfaction scores, and coordination efficiency metrics. She proceeded to present detailed data on every aspect of the task force's performance, from tactical operations to administrative efficiency. The statistics were impressive, but Sarah knew that numbers alone wouldn't capture what made the unit special. She needed to demonstrate the intangible factors that had contributed to their success. "General, if I may, I'd like to show you how our personnel actually work together during operational situations," Sarah continued. "Captain Morrison, would you please walk the General through our communication and coordination procedures using yesterday's exercise as an example?" Morrison stood and moved to the tactical display board with the confidence of an officer who knew his material thoroughly. As he explained the complex coordination required for multi-branch operations, Sarah watched General Chen's reaction carefully. The general asked detailed technical questions and seemed impressed by the thoroughness of Morrison's responses. "Captain Morrison," General Chen said, "this level of integration is exactly what we're trying to achieve across joint operations. How long did it take to develop these procedures?" "Sir, the procedures themselves were developed relatively quickly under Colonel Martinez's guidance," Morrison replied. "But the trust and confidence that make them work effectively took several weeks to establish. That's the element that can't be rushed or mandated through regulations." Sarah appreciated Morrison's response because it highlighted the critical importance of the cultural changes that had enabled the task force's success. Those changes would be the most challenging aspect of any expansion. The evaluation continued for 3 days, with team members observing everything from routine briefings to complex training exercises. Sarah made sure that General Chen and his team had access to personnel at every level, encouraging honest feedback about leadership, procedures, and unit effectiveness. On the final day of the evaluation, General Chen requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss his preliminary findings. As they sat in her office, Sarah could sense that he was impressed with what he had observed, but she also detected concern about the expansion plans. "Colonel Martinez," General Chen began, "this is one of the most effective joint units I've evaluated. Your personnel are confident, well-trained, and genuinely committed to the mission. The coordination procedures you've established are sophisticated but practical, and the unit's operational performance speaks for itself." "Thank you, sir. I'm proud of what the team has accomplished. However," the general continued, "I'm concerned about the expansion timeline that's been proposed. The Pentagon wants to triple the size of this unit within the next 6 months. Based on what I've observed, that kind of rapid growth could destroy the very capabilities that make the unit effective." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that the general understood the challenges, but concern about what his recommendation might mean for the task force's future. "General, what are you thinking in terms of alternative approaches?" "I'm going to recommend a phased expansion over 18 months, with careful attention to preserving unit culture and maintaining operational effectiveness at each stage. That will require more resources and patience from the Pentagon, but it's the only way to achieve sustainable growth." The conversation that followed was one of the most important of Sarah's career. General Chen explained that the Pentagon was under pressure to demonstrate rapid improvements in joint operations capability, largely due to evolving global threats that required the kind of coordinated response that Joint Task Force Alpha had proven it could deliver. However, he also understood that destroying successful units through poorly managed expansion was counterproductive in the long term. His recommendation would carry significant weight, but it would also require Sarah to demonstrate that the task force could manage gradual expansion while maintaining its effectiveness. "Colonel, I need you to understand that this recommendation will put you under a microscope," General Chen explained. "Every aspect of the expansion will be monitored and evaluated. If performance declines or problems develop, there will be pressure to revert to rapid growth approaches." "I understand, sir. What specific benchmarks will be used to evaluate our progress?" "Operational success rates, personnel satisfaction and retention, coordination efficiency, and integration speed for new personnel. You'll need to show continuous improvement in all areas while managing the expansion." As General Chen and his evaluation team departed, Sarah reflected on the challenge ahead. The task force had proven it could excel as a relatively small, carefully managed unit. Now it would need to demonstrate that its capabilities could scale up, while preserving the characteristics that made it special. The first test came 2 weeks later, when the initial group of new personnel arrived. 25 officers and enlisted personnel from various branches, each with different backgrounds, expectations, and experiences. Sarah had developed a comprehensive integration plan, but she knew that theory and practice were often very different things. She decided to personally brief each new arrival, something that time constraints might not permit as the expansion continued. These individual conversations would give her insight into the challenges and opportunities that new personnel represented. The first officer she met with was Commander Lisa Park, a Navy intelligence specialist with extensive experience in maritime operations. As they talked, Sarah was impressed by Park's technical expertise and professional bearing, but she also sensed that the commander had questions about how her capabilities would be utilized in a joint environment. "Commander, what attracted you to this assignment?" Sarah asked. "Ma'am, the Navy personnel system indicated that Joint Task Force Alpha was becoming a model for integrated operations. My experience has been mostly in single-service environments, and I wanted to broaden my capabilities. What are your concerns about working in a joint environment?" Park hesitated for a moment before responding. "Ma'am, I've heard that joint operations can be inefficient because of conflicting procedures and communication problems. I'm hoping that won't be the case here, but I'm prepared for a learning curve." Sarah appreciated the honest response and used it as an opportunity to explain the task force's approach to joint operations. As they talked, she could see Park's enthusiasm growing as she understood how her maritime expertise could contribute to the unit's overall capabilities. Similar conversations with other new arrivals revealed a pattern of cautious optimism mixed with uncertainty about how joint operations actually worked in practice. Most of the new personnel had heard about the task force's recent successes, but they had little understanding of the cultural and procedural changes that had enabled those successes. Sarah realized that the integration process would need to address not just technical training, but also the mindset changes required for effective joint operations. New personnel needed to understand that success in this environment required different skills and attitudes than they had developed in single service assignments. She decided to implement a mentor system that paired each new arrival with an experienced task force member from a different service branch. This would accelerate the learning process, while also reinforcing the cross-service cooperation that was essential to the unit's effectiveness. Captain Morrison volunteered to coordinate the mentor program, and his enthusiasm for the project demonstrated how much his own attitude had evolved since Sarah's arrival. The captain, who had initially been skeptical of Pentagon leadership, was now actively working to help new Pentagon-assigned personnel succeed. The mentor program's first major test came during a complex training exercise designed to evaluate how well new personnel could integrate with existing teams. Sarah watched from the command center as mixed teams of new and experienced personnel worked through simulated crisis scenarios. The results were mixed but encouraging. New personnel demonstrated technical competence but sometimes struggled with the rapid decision-making and flexible coordination that characterized the task force operations. However, the mentor relationships enabled quick course corrections and continuous learning throughout the exercise. More importantly, Sarah observed that experienced personnel were adapting their leadership styles to help new team members succeed rather than simply expecting them to adapt quickly. This was exactly the kind of organizational maturity that would be essential for managing continued expansion. As the first month of expansion concluded, Sarah prepared her initial progress report for General Chen and the Pentagon leadership. The data was positive in most areas, with some predictable challenges in coordination efficiency, as new personnel learned the task force's procedures. However, she also recognized that the real test was yet to come. The next phase of expansion would bring larger numbers of personnel, more complex integration challenges, and increased pressure to demonstrate that the task force could maintain its effectiveness while growing rapidly. The stakes were higher than ever, but Sarah felt confident that the foundation they had built could support continued growth. The question was whether external pressures and timeline demands would allow the gradual, careful approach that sustainable expansion required. 6 months into the expansion of Joint Task Force Alpha, Colonel Sarah Martinez faced the most serious crisis of her command. The task force had grown from a struggling unit of 80 personnel to a formidable organization of over 200. But with that growth had come unexpected challenges that threatened to undermine everything she had worked to build. The crisis began with what seemed like a routine intelligence briefing on a Thursday morning. Captain Morrison, now serving as the senior intelligence coordinator, presented information about unusual activity patterns in multiple sectors that had been detected over the previous week. Initially, the data appeared to represent separate, unrelated incidents, but Morrison's analysis suggested they might be part of a larger, coordinated operation. "Ma'am," Morrison reported, "we're seeing synchronized communication disruptions, equipment failures, and personnel movements across 6 different sectors. Individually, these incidents could be explained as maintenance issues or routine activities. However, the timing and geographic distribution suggest they're part of a deliberate intelligence-gathering operation." Sarah studied the data displays as Morrison explained his analysis. The pattern was subtle but consistent, exactly the kind of sophisticated operation that would require significant resources and extensive planning. More troubling was the implication that whoever was behind these activities had detailed knowledge of the task force's operating procedures and response capabilities. "Assessment of threat level?" Sarah asked. "Hi, ma'am. If this is what I think it is, someone is conducting detailed surveillance of our operations in preparation for a significant action. The intelligence gathering appears to be focused on our communication protocols, response times, and coordination procedures." Lieutenant Colonel Park, who had become Sarah's most trusted deputy during the expansion period, raised a concern that Sarah had been thinking about herself. "Ma'am, this could also be a test of our capabilities by higher headquarters. The Pentagon has been known to conduct unannounced evaluations of joint units, especially those that have received significant resources and attention. The possibility that this was an internal evaluation rather than an external threat added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. If Sarah responded as though it were a genuine threat and it turned out to be a Pentagon test, she could be criticized for overreacting. However, if she treated it as a test and it was actually a real threat, the consequences could be catastrophic. "Captain Morrison, I need you to conduct a more detailed analysis focusing on attribution," Sarah decided. "Try to determine whether this activity is consistent with known hostile capabilities or whether it matches the profile of internal evaluation operations." As Morrison and his team worked to refine their analysis, Sarah convened a meeting with her expanded senior staff. The growth of the task force had necessitated a more complex command structure, with additional department heads and specialized coordinators. While this had improved the unit's capabilities, it had also made decision-making more complicated and consensus-building more challenging. The meeting revealed the tensions that had been building during the rapid expansion period. Major Sandra Williams, a newly assigned Air Force officer who headed the expanded logistics department, expressed concerns about the task force's ability to respond effectively to a major threat. "Colonel, with all due respect, we've been so focused on integration and expansion that we may have lost some of our operational edge," Williams argued. "The new personnel are competent, but they haven't been tested under the kind of pressure that forged the original unit's effectiveness." Her comments sparked immediate pushback from Captain Morrison and other original task force members who felt their capabilities were being questioned. Sarah realized that the expansion had created 2 distinct groups within the unit: the original personnel who had proven themselves during the early crisis operations, and the newer personnel who were still working to establish their credibility and find their place in the organization. Major Williams raises valid concerns, Sarah acknowledged, but I disagree with her assessment. This unit's strength has never been based on a small group of individuals. It's been based on procedures, training, and commitment to mission success that can be shared and developed among all personnel. Commander Lisa Park, the Navy intelligence specialist who had become one of the most effective new additions to the unit, supported Sarah's position. "Ma'am, I've observed this unit's operations for 6 months now, and what impresses me most is how quickly new personnel are able to contribute meaningfully. That's not an accident. It's the result of systems and culture that enable rapid integration and effective performance." The discussion that followed revealed both the strengths and challenges of the expanded task force. The new personnel brought fresh perspectives and additional capabilities that had significantly enhanced the unit's overall effectiveness. However, they had also introduced complexity and occasionally conflicting approaches that required careful management. Sarah was about to summarize the discussion when Captain Morrison returned with updated intelligence analysis that changed everything. "Ma'am, I've completed the detailed attribution analysis," Morrison reported. "This is definitely not an internal evaluation. The intelligence gathering operation shows sophisticated techniques and resources that are consistent with state-level capabilities. We're dealing with a real threat." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Joint Task Force Alpha was facing the most serious challenge since Sarah had taken command, but now they would be responding with a much larger, more complex organization that had never been tested as a cohesive unit under genuine pressure. "Threat timeline?" Sarah asked. "Based on the pattern of intelligence-gathering activities, I estimate that whatever operation is being planned will be executed within the next 72 hours. Morrison replied. "The surveillance appears to be in final phases, which typically indicates imminent action." Sarah looked around the room at her expanded senior staff. These were capable, experienced officers, but they represented a mix of backgrounds, experiences, and approaches that had never been tested together under combat conditions. The next few days would determine whether the expansion had strengthened or weakened the task force's ability to respond to serious threats. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to immediate heightened readiness status," she announced. "I want all departments to review their personnel assignments, verify equipment readiness, and confirm communication protocols. We're going to respond to this threat as one unified organization, regardless of service branch or length of assignment." The next 24 hours tested every system and procedure that had been developed during the expansion period. The coordination challenges were immediately apparent. With more personnel and departments, even routine communications took longer and required more careful management. However, Sarah also observed that the expanded capabilities enabled responses that wouldn't have been possible with the original smaller unit. The crisis intensified when long-range surveillance detected unusual activity near the Regional Communication Center, a facility that was critical to the task force's ability to coordinate with higher headquarters and other military units. Intelligence analysis suggested that hostile forces were preparing to conduct an operation designed to isolate the task force and limit its ability to request support or coordinate responses. Sarah faced a decision that would define not just the outcome of this particular crisis, but the future effectiveness of Joint Task Force Alpha. She could respond conservatively, focusing on defensive measures while requesting additional support from higher headquarters. This approach would minimize risk, but might allow hostile forces to achieve their objectives. Alternatively, she could authorize aggressive, preemptive operations designed to disrupt hostile activities before they could be executed. The decision was complicated by the fact that her expanded command structure included officers who favored different approaches. Some of the newer personnel advocated for conservative responses that followed standard procedures and minimized risk. Others, particularly the original task force members, supported more aggressive actions based on their confidence in the unit's capabilities. "Ma'am," Major Williams argued, "we should focus on defensive preparations while requesting support from higher headquarters. We don't have complete intelligence on hostile capabilities, and committing to offensive operations could expose us to unacceptable risks." Captain Morrison disagreed strongly. "Ma'am, if we wait for additional support, we'll be responding to a completed hostile operation rather than preventing it. Our intelligence indicates that the hostiles plan to strike within hours. Defensive measures won't be sufficient to prevent significant damage." Sarah realized that this decision would send a message about her confidence in the expanded task force's capabilities. If she chose conservative options, it would suggest that she didn't trust the new personnel to perform effectively under pressure. However, if she authorized aggressive operations and they failed, the consequences could be devastating for both the mission and the unit's future. "I'm authorizing preemptive operations designed to neutralize the threat before hostile forces can execute their planned attack," she announced. "This will be a coordinated multi-element operation that will require every department to perform at the highest level." The response was immediate and professional, but Sarah could sense the mixture of confidence and anxiety that her decision had generated. The original task force members showed obvious confidence in their ability to execute complex operations, while newer personnel demonstrated determination to prove themselves worthy of the trust she had placed in them. The operation that unfolded over the next 18 hours was the most complex that Joint Task Force Alpha had ever attempted. Multiple teams conducted simultaneous missions across a wide geographic area, requiring sophisticated coordination and constant communication. The expanded command structure that had seemed cumbersome during routine operations proved essential for managing the complexity of multiple concurrent actions. Commander Park's maritime expertise enabled innovative approaches to coastal surveillance that provided critical intelligence about hostile activities. Major Williams's expanded logistics capabilities ensured that all elements had the resources they needed to sustain operations over an extended period. Most importantly, the newer personnel demonstrated that they had successfully absorbed the task force's operational culture and could perform effectively under pressure. The breakthrough came when Team Delta, composed entirely of personnel who had joined during the expansion, successfully intercepted hostile communications that revealed the complete scope of the planned operation. The intelligence they gathered enabled Sarah to coordinate a comprehensive response that not only neutralized the immediate threat, but also captured key intelligence about the hostile organization's broader capabilities and intentions. "Ma'am," Morrison reported as the operation concluded, "Teams Alpha through Echo have successfully completed all assigned missions. Hostile capabilities in the target area have been neutralized, and we've gathered extensive intelligence for follow-up operations." Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and pride as she reviewed the operational results. Joint Task Force Alpha had not just survived its first major test as an expanded unit, it had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what either the original or expanded elements could have achieved independently. More importantly, the operation had proven that the cultural integration she had worked so hard to achieve was real and sustainable. Personnel who had been strangers 6 months earlier had worked together seamlessly under the most demanding conditions, demonstrating the kind of trust and confidence that couldn't be mandated but had to be earned through shared experiences. As the after-action briefings concluded, Sarah reflected on how much the task force had evolved since her arrival over a year earlier. They had grown from a struggling unit with poor morale and questionable effectiveness to a formidable organization capable of conducting complex, multifaceted operations against sophisticated opponents. However, she also understood that this success would bring new challenges. The Pentagon would certainly take notice of the task force's enhanced capabilities, and with that attention would come new missions, additional resources, and continued pressure to expand and evolve. The question was whether Joint Task Force Alpha could maintain its effectiveness while adapting to whatever new demands would be placed upon it. Today had proven that the foundation they had built was strong enough to support continued growth, but Sarah knew that the most difficult challenges might still lie ahead. Captain Morrison approached her as she prepared to brief higher headquarters on the operation's success. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for having confidence in this unit's capabilities, including the newer personnel. Today proved that the expansion has made us stronger rather than weaker. Captain, today proved that effective leadership isn't about preserving what you have. It's about building capabilities that can adapt and grow while maintaining their core strengths. This unit is ready for whatever challenges come next." As Sarah began drafting her report to the Pentagon, she felt confident that Joint Task Force Alpha had become the kind of organization that could serve as a model for military excellence in an increasingly complex world. The expansion that had seemed so threatening just months earlier had actually strengthened the unit's capabilities and prepared it for even greater achievements in the future. 2 years after Colonel Sarah Martinez first walked onto the tarmac at Joint Task Force Alpha, she stood in the same spot, watching a very different organization conduct its morning operations. The base buzzed with the confident activity of nearly 400 personnel representing all branches of the military, working together with a precision and effectiveness that had become the envy of military units worldwide. The transformation had not gone unnoticed in Washington. Joint Task Force Alpha had become the Pentagon's showcase for joint operations, and Sarah found herself regularly briefing senior officials and international partners on the principles and practices that had enabled such dramatic organizational success. However, with recognition had come new pressures, and expectations that would test her leadership in ways she never anticipated. The morning briefing that would change everything began routinely enough. Captain Morrison, now a major and serving as the Deputy Operations Director, presented the overnight intelligence summary to an audience of department heads that had grown to include specialists in cyber operations, special activities, international coordination, and advanced technology integration. "Ma'am, we've received a priority tasking from the Joint Chiefs of Staff," Morrison reported. "The nature of this assignment is significantly different from our previous missions, and it comes with a timeline that will challenge our current capabilities." Sarah studied the classified briefing materials as Morrison outlined the mission parameters. Joint Task Force Alpha was being tasked with leading a multinational operation involving forces from 6 different countries, coordination with civilian agencies, and integration of capabilities that had never been combined in a single operation. The scope was ambitious beyond anything the task force had previously attempted. "Timeline for execution?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be problematic. 6 weeks from today, ma'am. The operation window is fixed due to external factors beyond our control, and there's no possibility of extension. The room fell silent as the senior staff absorbed the magnitude of what was being asked. Leading a multinational operation required not just military expertise but diplomatic skills, cultural sensitivity, and coordination capabilities that exceeded anything in their previous experience. More challenging was the fact that they would need to establish working relationships with international partners while maintaining the operational security essential for mission success. Commander Lisa Park, now serving as the Senior Intelligence Coordinator, raised the concern that everyone was thinking about. "Ma'am, this type of operation typically requires months of preparation and relationship building. 6 weeks seems insufficient for establishing the trust and coordination mechanisms that multinational operations require." Sarah appreciated Park's assessment because it highlighted the central challenge they faced. Joint Task Force Alpha had proven that it could integrate personnel from different U.S. military branches effectively, but working with international partners involved entirely different complexities related to language, culture, operational procedures, and political sensitivities. "What specific international partners are we working with?" she asked. Morrison consulted his briefing materials. British Special Air Service, French Foreign Legion Special Operations Units, German KSK Commandos, Japanese Self-Defense Force Intelligence Specialists, Australian SASR teams, and Canadian Joint Task Force 2 elements. Each partner brings unique capabilities, but they also have different command structures, communication protocols, and operational cultures. As Sarah listened to the briefing, she realized that this mission represented both the ultimate validation of Joint Task Force Alpha's capabilities and the greatest risk to everything they had built. Success would establish the unit as the premier joint and coalition operations organization in the world. Failure would likely result in the dissolution of the task force and the end of her military career. More importantly, she understood that this mission would require her to apply the same principles that had enabled the task force's domestic success to a much more complex international environment. The cultural integration, trust-building, and collaborative leadership approaches that had worked with American military personnel would need to be adapted for partners with entirely different backgrounds and expectations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced to her senior staff, "this mission represents exactly the kind of challenge that Joint Task Force Alpha was ultimately designed to handle. We're going to approach it the same way we've approached every other challenge, through careful preparation, open communication, and absolute commitment to mission success." The preparation phase that followed was unlike anything the task force had previously undertaken. Sarah divided her time between detailed operational planning and intensive diplomatic coordination with international partners. Each conversation revealed new complexities and potential areas of conflict that would need to be managed carefully. Her first video conference with Colonel James Hartwell of the British Special Air Service set the tone for the challenges ahead. Hartwell was a veteran officer with extensive international experience, but Sarah could sense his skepticism about American leadership of such a complex operation. "Colonel Martinez," Hartwell said with characteristic British directness, "I've reviewed your unit's record and your domestic achievements are impressive. However, international operations present different challenges. How do you plan to coordinate 6 different national contingents with varying capabilities, procedures, and political constraints?" "Colonel Hartwell, you raise valid concerns," Sarah replied. "Our approach will be based on the same principles that have enabled our success domestically: clear communication, mutual respect for different capabilities and perspectives, and shared commitment to mission objectives. We're not trying to impose American procedures on international partners. We're trying to create hybrid approaches that leverage everyone's strengths." The conversation that followed was both challenging and encouraging. Hartwell pressed Sarah on specific operational details, command relationships, and contingency planning. His questions were tough but fair, and Sarah could sense that he was evaluating not just her technical competence, but her ability to lead in a complex international environment. Similar conversations with other international partners revealed a pattern of cautious optimism, mixed with concerns about American tendencies toward unilateral decision-making. Sarah realized that her first challenge would be establishing credibility with experienced international officers who had worked with American units that failed to appreciate the value of genuine partnership. The breakthrough came during her conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Marie Dubois of the French Foreign Legion. Dubois had worked extensively with international partners and had developed strong opinions about what made coalition operations successful or unsuccessful. "Colonel Martinez," Dubois said, "the failure of most international operations can be traced to inadequate preparation time and insufficient attention to relationship building. Your timeline is very aggressive for this type of mission." "You're absolutely right, Colonel Dubois," Sarah acknowledged. "That's why I'm proposing an intensive preparation period where all partner units work together continuously rather than trying to coordinate separately and then integrate at the last minute." The idea of bringing all international partners to a single location for intensive preparation was unprecedented for an operation of this scope. But Sarah believed it was the only way to build the relationships and understanding necessary for success. The proposal required significant resources and diplomatic coordination, but she was convinced it was essential. General Patricia Hayes, the Pentagon official who had initially supported Sarah's leadership of the task force, was skeptical when Sarah presented the integrated preparation proposal. "Colonel, that kind of intensive preparation period will be expensive and complex to coordinate," General Hayes pointed out. "Are you confident it's necessary?" "Ma'am, this mission will fail if we try to coordinate 6 international contingents without first establishing genuine working relationships," Sarah replied. "The additional preparation costs are minimal compared to the consequences of operational failure." The discussion that followed was one of the most important of Sarah's career. She was essentially arguing for a completely different approach to international military cooperation, one that prioritized relationship building and cultural integration over traditional command and control methods. General Joint Task Force Alpha's success has been based on understanding that effective coordination can't be mandated. It has to be developed through shared experiences and mutual trust, Sarah explained. That principle applies whether we're working with different American military branches or different national militaries. General Hayes approved the intensive preparation period, but Sarah understood that the decision placed enormous pressure on her to deliver results. The Pentagon was investing significant resources in an unproven approach to international coordination, and failure would have consequences that extended far beyond Joint Task Force Alpha. The 3-week intensive preparation period that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. Personnel from 6 different countries worked together daily on everything from tactical procedures to communication protocols to cultural awareness. The initial period was challenging, with frequent misunderstandings and conflicts over procedures and priorities. However, Sarah began to observe the same relationship-building process that had occurred within Joint Task Force Alpha during its early development. International partners who had initially been skeptical about working together began to develop mutual respect and understanding as they learned about each other's capabilities and approaches. Major Morrison, who had become Sarah's most trusted advisor, coordinated the technical aspects of the integration, while Sarah focused on the diplomatic and leadership challenges. His ability to work effectively with international partners demonstrated how much he had evolved since their first confrontational encounter 2 years earlier. "Ma'am," Morrison reported after the first week of joint preparation, "the progress has been remarkable. International partners are adapting to collaborative planning approaches much faster than I expected, and they're contributing innovative solutions that we wouldn't have developed independently." The comment highlighted one of the most significant benefits of genuine international cooperation: the opportunity to learn from different approaches and develop hybrid solutions that were more effective than anything any single country could produce alone. The operational test came during the final week of preparation, when all partners conducted a comprehensive exercise designed to simulate the actual mission conditions. Sarah watched from the command center as teams from 6 different countries executed complex, coordinated operations with a precision that would have seemed impossible just 3 weeks earlier. More importantly, She observed that the international partners had developed the kind of mutual confidence and trust that enabled rapid adaptation when unexpected situations arose. Instead of reverting to national procedures when problems occurred, they worked together to develop solutions that leveraged everyone's capabilities. Colonel Hartwell approached Sarah as the exercise concluded. "Colonel Martinez, I owe you an apology for my initial skepticism. This level of international integration is unprecedented in my experience." "Colonel, your skepticism was appropriate and professional," Sarah replied. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and this type of integration had never been proven at this scale before." As the actual mission approached, Sarah felt confident that Joint Task Force Alpha and its international partners were as prepared as possible for the complex operation ahead. However, she also understood that real-world conditions would present challenges that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. The mission itself unfolded over 5 days and involved simultaneous operations across multiple time zones, coordination with civilian agencies, and integration of capabilities ranging from cyber operations to special reconnaissance to direct action. The complexity was staggering, but the preparation period had established the relationships and procedures necessary to manage that complexity effectively. The breakthrough moment came on the 3rd day when unexpected developments required rapid modification of operational plans. Instead of the confusion and conflicts that typically characterize such situations in multinational operations, Sarah watched as international partners worked together seamlessly to develop and implement new approaches that addressed the changed conditions. "Ma'am," the British operations coordinator reported, "all international elements have successfully adapted to the modified operational parameters. Coordination remains effective across all partner units." The mission concluded with complete success across all objectives, but more importantly, it established a new model for international military cooperation that would influence operations worldwide. Joint Task Force Alpha had proven that genuine integration of international capabilities was possible when approached with adequate preparation and commitment to collaborative leadership. As Sarah prepared her final report on the mission, she reflected on how far she and the task force had come since that first challenging morning 2 years earlier. They had evolved from a struggling domestic unit to the world's premier example of joint and coalition military operations. However, she also understood that success brought new responsibilities and expectations. Joint Task Force Alpha would now be tasked with training other units in international cooperation, leading increasingly complex missions, and serving as a model for military excellence in an interconnected world. The captain who had once mocked her rank now served as one of her most trusted advisors, and had become a strong advocate for the collaborative leadership approaches that had enabled their success. The transformation was complete, both for the individual and for the organization. Standing once again on the tarmac where her journey had begun, Sarah watched as international partners prepared to return to their home countries. The relationships that had been built during this mission would endure and would enable future cooperation that would have been impossible under traditional approaches. Joint Task Force Alpha had become more than just a successful military unit. It had become proof that effective leadership could overcome any challenge when based on principles of mutual respect, shared commitment, and collaborative problem-solving. The future would bring new challenges, but Sarah was confident that the foundation they had built could support whatever missions they would be asked to undertake.